I was looking at the app I like to use when finding free stuff and I happened to see the one for this trimmer. Now this is not a substantial machine, in fact it's about the furthest thing away from it. But all I want is something easy to start and reliable. Well, unfortunately it's not that either, but it's what we have to work with and hopefully we can fix that today. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Homelite string trimmer. And the problem is that I just picked it up and I have no idea what's wrong with it. But based on how it looks, I'm guessing that it's not going to start. Now, I'm not saying that it can't happen, but most people don't give away working items. Now, I'm going to try and repair this string trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you like in the video, please ask about it and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, the ad wasn't just for the string trimmer, they had other items that were giving away as well. And unfortunately, they didn't make any claims about the condition of the trimmer. So we might as well put some fuel into it and see what happens. Just make sure that the fuel lines are not broken and that the fuel filter is still connected as well. Now the first real test is seeing whether or not the bulb fills with any fuel. And if it does not fill with any fuel, well, there's no point in even trying to start it then. Unfortunately, it didn't start, which could mean the carb is not working to deliver any fuel to the engine. Next, I'm going to take off the air filter cover and add fuel to the carb and see what happens. Well, I guess we know why they gave this trimmer away. It simply will not start. So next, I want to check and see if maybe we lost spark from the engine by using a spark checker. Now to use it, just install it in line with a spark plug, pull the rope and watch for an orange glow in the tester. And to make it easier to see the glow, try moving to a shaded area. So as you just saw, there was an orange glow from the tester, meaning we do have spark. But what if the spark wasn't happening inside the engine because of a bad plug? Now, I'm not sure if this is the original spark plug that came with it, but I don't care for this brand at all. But what I'm looking for is whether or not there's something interfering with the spark, which I don't see. However, the plug is quite wet with fuel from the multiple attempts to try and start it. So in the meantime, I'm going to replace the plug with a different one that's brand new. Then we'll add some fuel and try starting it again and see what happens. Well, that's not good news. Now I have to wonder if there's not enough compression from the engine. And to find out, I'm going to use my compression tester, which will measure how much pressure the engine can make. The higher the reading, the healthier the engine is, but if we get a low reading, it means something is terribly wrong. So the reading is a very high 150 psi, which means the engine is extremely healthy. That can only mean one thing: the engine isn't starting because it's flooded with way too much fuel. Now typically, I would try and clear a flooded engine by holding the trigger down and with no choke, try starting the engine. There's just one problem: that technique was not working, which means we'll have to find some other way to dry out the engine. But before we do that, I'm going to give this trimmer a quick spray and rinse. And the reason why is because we'll need to open this engine and I don't want to get any dirt inside it. So let me explain. If you don't want to wait for this engine to dry out, on this particular engine, you can open it to do the very same thing. Now I know that sounds a bit extreme, but there is another way to do it though. However, it takes about the same amount of time. And since the fuel tank will be out of the way, we might as well replace those fuel lines as well. Now most engines will not have a lower portion like this one to take off. And if that's the case, just take out the spark plug and leave the engine out in the sun for a couple of hours. And after taking off the cover to the engine, we'll spin it over and watch the excess oil and fuel come out of it. You don't have to pull with any real force because it will evaporate by itself anyway. So here's the big question: why is the engine flooding anyway? Is it just from the failed attempts to start it? Or is there a different reason that's causing it to have this problem? Well, the most likely reason why it's flooding is a carb that's not controlling fuel flow like it should be. Now these fuel lines look a bit odd. They don't appear to be the same kind, meaning someone has replaced them at some point in its life. Now the only good bit of news when dealing with these lines is that we will be able to reuse the fuel filter. The reason why that's important is because the profit margin on something like this is very low. That's because the selling price for this trimmer is extremely low, and despite getting it for free, it only helps out a little bit. After cutting the fuel line at an angle, you should be able to push them into the opening. Now the first fuel line will be the return line, which means it only has to extend about an inch or two into the tank. The second fuel line, however, is going to be the fuel filter line, and it needs to be extremely long. And after pulling out several inches of line, we'll then cut off the angle piece and install the spring and the fuel filter. Now the spring is optional. In fact, most machines won't even come with one. But since this one came with one, we'll do it justice and put it on as well. Once the filter is back in the tank, make sure it's located in a spot where it can pick up as much fuel as possible. Now that we're done with the fuel tank, next we'll take a look at the carb and see if there's anything wrong with it. And after taking off the pumping section, we can then see the body of the carb along with the inlet screen. And from what I can tell, the screen is completely clean, and so is the rest of the carb. Now based on everything I've seen so far, this carb is in great condition, and I'm not too worried about doing an in-depth cleaning on it, but that only leaves us with the metering diaphragm to look at. Now the purpose of the diaphragm is to control fuel flow through the carb, but if it's hardened over time, it won't be able to do that. And after getting the plate free from the carb, it's really tough to tell what kind of condition the diaphragm is in. And to get a better idea, we need to separate it from the plate and the gasket. Now take your time doing this, otherwise you could damage the gasket, which is kind of difficult to source. And as you just heard, the gasket is a bit stiff and crunchy, which is not good. So it's not completely petrified, and there's a very good chance that we could save it by soaking it in a rejuvenation bath. Of course, it won't be ready for this project, but we could end up using it in a later one. That means we'll be replacing it with a brand new one, and as you just saw, it's extremely flexible. Don't forget to install the gasket first to the carb, followed by the metering diaphragm. I also ended up replacing the purge bulb, not because it was broken, only because once they start to discolor, you have no idea when they're about to break. If you recall, I mentioned another way to quickly dry out the engine. And if you saw the last video on the pole and leaf blower, you already know what I'm talking about. And the method I'm talking about is to take out the spark plug and remove the muffler. Then blow compressed air into the spark plug opening for about a minute or two. So do you really need to take the muffler off to use this method? Well, that's up to you. I just find that it works a whole lot better if you do. Also, don't forget to install the gasket between the carb and the engine in the correct direction as well. Otherwise, the impulse signal from the engine won't make it to the carb and it may not run correctly. Now, if your situation is not like this one, where you don't know if the engine is good, but instead it's your own personal trimmer and you know its history, then you might just make the choice to buy a brand new carb instead of servicing the old one. So when connecting the fuel lines, the fuel filter line will connect to the brass port further away from the bulb. That means the return line will connect to the port closer to the bulb. And before we go any further, I'm going to add some fuel to the tank and then test the flow through the system. So if the flow is not working or is in the wrong direction, the engine might develop running or even starting problems. So when pressing on the purge bulb, fuel should come up the filter line, enter the carb, fill the bulb up, and then leave through the return line going back to the tank. And as you just saw, fuel is flowing through the lines just like they're supposed to. Also, I do have to let you know that on this kind of system, you should not see any fuel inside this area. Now because I'm filming this repair, I'm going to leave off the filter cover to make it easier to see what I'm doing. That's because depending upon how things go, we might have to use our carb adjusting tools to make some changes to the screws. So the screws are on the front of the carb, and the one closer to the engine is the L screw. And it's meant for adjusting fuel flow at low engine speeds. While the screw closer to the air filter base is the H screw, and it's meant for full engine speed adjustments. And the Phillips head screw above them is to change the idle speed. So the good news is that it started and ran, but the bad news was that it needed a carb adjustment to get it running better. Now luckily, it responded to the adjustments well, and now it's running just the way we want it to. So basically, we turned the L screw out enough to allow for no bogging on quick throttle squeezes. Then when adjusting the H screw by holding down the trigger and finding when the engine speed was the highest. Now you cannot leave it there, otherwise the engine would overheat and wear out faster than it's supposed to. Instead, the extra turn will richen up the mixture and help to keep the engine cool. So we can't be sure if the engine was flooding before they decided to give it away, or it's only now flooding from the lack of care and maintenance leading up to them deciding to give it away. Either way, it's here now, and all we need to do is a couple more cold starts, making sure that it starts and runs well. Now these are not terrible trimmers, but by the way most people treat them, it makes it seem that way. So my question is, would you want to use this trimmer as a backup or sell it only to make almost no money on it? Now to be honest, it's almost better just to keep it because I know I'm never going to be paid what I put into it. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.